Hi there. Here we are again with the cat. I don't know if anybody watches these videos, but I don't care because I just think aloud if I can. It's a bit slippery here. I would like to write a philosophical paper. It would be a nice change because I sort of have a metaphysical position. I don't want to go there because it's too difficult terrain. I have a metaphysical position, sort of, but I'm also against metaphysics because it's stepping outside the scope of what can be conceptualized or understood or represented, because what I consider as metaphysical is what is beyond the observable or things in themselves. That's what I take to be the fundamental nature of reality that the mystics speak of. It's things in themselves. But as people who know Immanuel Kant's philosophy might be aware, the notion of thing in itself has two meanings. The first is intrinsic nature in contrast to relational properties or essence. Like, for example, I was going to use the cat as example, but it's problematic because the cat in itself is already a process. It consists of several cells, living cells, in constant interaction, and the cells consist of atoms, which consist of quarks and whatever quantum fluctuations or quantum fields there are at the very bottom, at the fundamental level of things. But intrinsic nature in this relational sense simply means like the non-relational essence of something. So if you take formally thing A and thing B, A and B, the way that A is related to B or anything else is its relational nature. But the way A is in itself, independently of its relation to B, that's its intrinsic nature in this relativistic sense of intrinsic. Or it could be called also... Sä haluaisit mennä sinne alas, mutta kun ei mennä, se on liian liukasta kuule. It could also be called the metaphysical or ontological sense of the term intrinsic nature. So, for example, if we take Newtonian mechanics, for example, we define everything in relational terms. For example, force can be defined in relation to mass and acceleration. If you set a force on a thing, it accelerates at a certain pace depending on its mass. And this is all relational. Force is defined in relation to mass and acceleration, and so on. This applies to all, basically everything in physics. It's all relational. The equations always define relationships with some variables, A and B, and intrinsic nature in this metaphysical sense means the non-relational nature of A and B. But this is from philosophy. This is what some philosophers think, like Philip Goff, for example, or Bertrand Russell, I think, thought in this way. It's called also the categorical nature of something, that is its non-dispositional nature. Like, for example, an electron can be defined in terms of its dispositions, how it's disposed to behave in the vicinity of other entities, like it repels other electrons, for example, or it gets a certain kind of acceleration in an electromagnetic field. And the cat is obviously dispositional, true and true. It consists of, well, it's disposed to do something when I touch it. Yes, hello cat, hello. And the philosophers talk about non-relational essences, categorical essences, or some people call them the inscrutables. But does it make sense to consider that anything ever has non-relational nature? I think not. The cat is a process. I am a process. And processes are always interactions between several entities, like the cells interacting, the atoms interacting. Does it make sense to speak of an atom beyond the way it interacts with everything else? I don't think so. At least in science we don't make this kind of distinction. In physics, nothing. This makes no sense to speak of thing in itself in this sense, in this relational or yes, in this metaphysical sense. I call this the metaphysical sense of the intrinsic nature because it makes metaphysical commitments. It says that things like cats have some intrinsic nature independent of their relations. And I think there is a, at least prima facie, conflict with process ontology here. If everything is just processes, then nothing has an intrinsic nature, because the intrinsic nature in this non-relational sense is, or categorical essence, it's just something static that never changes. And the change that we observe is due to these intrinsic natures, like this island type A's and B's interacting with each other. Well, the argument of it's so slippery, the rock, so I wouldn't like to go there now. Let's see if I circle around somehow. Yeah, the philosophers, of course, they have arguments for the categorical nature or these inscrutables. Okay, that's our sports for today. They have arguments for why objects would have non-relational essences. For example, they argue, if A is disposed to interact in a certain way with B, then this must be due to how A and B are in themselves, independently of that interaction. If I'm disposed to interact with the cat in a certain way, like pet it, for example, it must be grounded in the way that the cat is in itself and the way that I am in myself. I think this is just silly. Like, philosophers can make endless arguments like this, but I think we should rely mainly on physics regarding what the nature of reality is. And well, I'm not a physicist, and physicists are not metaphysicians, obviously. Not again, I need to slide. This is so Wait, odota, paikka. She wants to go deeper into the woods. Yes, in physics everything is relational, or always everything is process. Things interacting, but then you can ask, or the philosopher can ask, how is it possible for anything to interact if there is nothing to interact? You know, if there are no objects that would interact, then how is it possible that anything would interact? You know, it makes intuitive sense, sort of. I don't know whether it makes sense. I think everything can be a process without there being any like distinct entities interacting. Let's forget about that. Let's just assume, like philosophers do, that everything is just a process of interacting things. You could say, then what are the things? What are the intrinsic nature of those things? Well, physics makes no sense for the common sense. I think even the quantum so-called collapse of the superposition, it makes no sense. I think it might make more sense if we think of everything as a process, like Carlo Rovelli, the physicist who argues for this relational interpretation of quantum mechanics. He says that nothing exists in itself. So basically, that's something that we call things. It's somehow, it sort of emerges in interaction. So nothing exists in itself. In order for anything to exist, there must be interaction or something happening. There must be happening. Okay, but how is this related to the original point of, like, I have a metaphysics, or if I don't have? Well, by metaphysics we usually think of things like idealism, materialism, metaphysics. That is our ontology, and this is related to the role of mind in the reality. Like, where is the place of consciousness in the reality? And this is what interests me most, the so-called mind-body problem. And we started off from this intrinsic nature, like fundamental nature of reality. What are things in themselves, in this Kantian sense? Yes, and in Kant research, like, people interpret Kant in two different ways, and like what Kant meant by intrinsic nature, or like things in themselves, what he meant by that. So the first interpretation is this relational that I have been describing here, where intrinsic nature of an object is defined as its non-relational nature, the way that the object is independently of how it's related to everything else. So this is the main point in the relational interpretation of what the thing in itself is. Okay, but there is another interpretation, and on that reading, and these are mainly from Ray Langton, or where I have taken them. Ray Langton, philosopher who wrote a book on Kant. On the other interpretation, which I would call epistemological, the thing in itself is simply the thing as it is independently of my way of perceiving it, or conceiving of it, or my way of representing it. So I think this makes, at least for me, it makes perfect intuitive sense. So the cat, even if I would die in this place, the cat would continue to exist. It would move on in her life. Forget about me. Yeah, that's the way cats are. They are nasty little bastards. They don't really care about you. Yes, they do. No, ei mennä sinne niin. If she goes there, it's like really difficult to get her outside. Sometimes I let her like loose from the leash, like let her go free. But once she got away from me, she was away for 2 hours before she came back. And of course you cannot let cats go outside here free because they will eat birds and squirrels, and they are like foreign species, really predators. But yes, the cat in itself, in this epistemological sense, or what I would call the epistemological sense, is simply the cat as it is independently of my representations of the cat. If I cease to be, the cat continues to exist. These fantastic little mushrooms here. The intrinsic nature of these mushrooms in the epistemological sense is simply the way the mushrooms are beyond our seeing them in this way, as having this particular kind of shape, or even the biological descriptions of these mushrooms as interacting cells and the mycorrhizas and whatever, like they are all abstractions in our mind. It's not the way the mushrooms are in themselves. The mushrooms have existed long before us humans, and the way the mushrooms are in themselves are simply the way that they are. And it makes perfect sense to consider the mushrooms as processes, or even this rock, even though it looks static, but it's a process. It's in fact, it's just like it was melted long time ago, and now it's fixed in this position, like relatively fixed, but it changes just very slow compared to our like human timeline or perspective, temporal perspective. The cat is obviously a process. But even if everything is a process, and even if this is important, even if everything lacks an intrinsic nature in this relational sense, or in this metaphysical sense, nevertheless everything has intrinsic nature in the epistemological sense, which means simply the way that thing is beyond my perceiving of it. If I don't look at it, I don't perceive it in any way, I don't think about it, I just think about those leaves and all the microbes that live in there, all the fungi. Still the cat existed in the meantime. And what was it? What was it like? Well, only the cat knows. It's the way the cat is in itself, independently of my personal perception of it, or anyone else perceiving or abstracting, writing stories and biological theories of cats. That's the way the cat is in itself, in this epistemological sense. The intrinsic nature of the cat is simply the cat. The way that thing that my finger points to, that's the cat in itself, in this epistemological sense. I think this is already the metaphysical position that I would defend, and I have already. Now this gets difficult. I need to throw that there, and then I go the other way. I need to speak less and try to control the cat better. Moro. Mä tulenkin täältä. And now she's surprised because I came from the wrong side. Heippa. Heippa. So, but this is also related to the mind-body problem. This is basically, I have said this all like many times before, but I think I need to say it again because people still don't understand. Mostly the lay people understand, but other philosophers often lose the point. Well, I don't know about that. I just feel like writing some philosophy for a moment, like for a change. And these two meanings of intrinsic nature, of two meanings of thing in itself, or two meanings of the fundamental nature of reality. Actually, yes, this is the presentation that I had during the last two conferences, basically. The fundamental nature of reality, that's where we are led to, ultimately. So is it mental, material, or something else? And when we consider this question, we bear in mind this distinction between what is meant by intrinsic nature or fundamental nature of reality. Do we mean by it some kind of relational, non-relational nature of things, or simply things beyond our perceptions and representations of them? And then we have a third related notion. I'm sorry, now this is like completely messy, but that's the way it goes. This is just my improvisation to clear my mind, and I don't speak for anyone in particular, just for myself and the cat. So the third related notion, related to the fundamental nature of reality, it's that something which everything is, like everything in the reality, the cat, me, the trees, the rocks, the sun, the clouds, like everything, that's something which everything is instances or forms of. That's the fundamental nature of reality in the metaphysical sense. So I think in the article I would need to discuss all these three related notions of intrinsic nature or fundamental nature. And well, this is the golden grail of metaphysics, the fundamental nature of reality, what everything is. Well, I doubt that it makes sense. Like, why would there be a single substance or something which everything is forms of? Of course, in physics, again, I think at the bottom there are quantum fields, but they are many, not a single thing. And we haven't been able, or the physicists haven't been able to come up with a like theory of everything which would combine all the different forces and stuff. I'm not so familiar with that topic, but from a physical point of view, it seems that there might not be any single fundamental nature of the reality. It's be like arrogant to think that there would be that kind of, that we would be able to know at least. Oh, sorry. Up again and then down. No. Nyt mennään täällä polkua pitkin. Tuu tänne näin. Tuu tänne. Nyt ei mennä. Now I refuse to go. This will the battle of wills with the cat. I won't go up again because it's too slippery. Okay, so in physics there is no single fundamental nature of reality, at least presently. Correct me if I'm wrong. But in philosophy, of course, the great philosophers, they have all kinds of fine ideas. They may say that everything is physical at the fundamental level. Like everything is fundamentally physical. That's physicalism. Well, you can say that, but what does it mean? Like all the biological entities here, my consciousness, the cat, the sun, electrons, the stars, the whole universe, what information does it convey to us to say that it's all physical? Like, does it make even sense? Like, for any word to have any meaning, it would require a contrast, something else, so that we would be able to understand it. Like, does it make sense to speak of that everything is X, unless there is some non-X that we can contrast X with, you know? Like to say that everything is love. Does it make sense if there is no evil or like hatred as well? Hello? Hello, cat? Yes. The battle of the wills. I have won. maybe we both did. She's happy again. Kuka on hieno kyssä, kuka on hieno kyssä, niin. It lifts her tail up when I say that she's a good girl. Yes. Okay, back to philosophy. Soon I will go home. Yes, the fundamental nature of reality. Well, basically, like nothing really. It's not so serious because it's not like compared to like our lives and all the war going on and all the problems of humanity. Like, is there any like relevance of this all? Well, I think there sort of is. Look at how funny that tree is. Like the mushrooms have eaten the tree. Soon it will fall down. Interesting. Everything is a process. Yeah, but the way that we conceive of ourselves in relation to the reality, for example, in physicalism, consciousness is a problem in physicalism. That's the hard problem of consciousness, which should actually be called the hard problem of physicalism. Like how to explain how consciousness emerges from the brain. That is how consciousness emerges from non-conscious dead matter. Well, I don't think there is any problem if we think that consciousness is actually physical. It's a neural biochemical process in the brain in humans. In other animals or entities it could be something else, but nevertheless all forms of consciousness, animal consciousness or other, if there are other forms of something that we could call consciousness, it's all physical. That's the most plausible explanation of consciousness, that it's all physical. You know, all the like biochemical correlations between consciousness, the way that you can manipulate consciousness in humans by manipulating the brain and so on. There's like lots and lots of evidence for the hypothesis that consciousness is physical. And this is now the crucial point, because it shows us how little we know about the physical. Now I'm going a bit too far, I think, like compared to the original idea of the fundamental nature of reality, the original question, because this leads to quite deep topics going to the mind-body problem. But I try to I think this is unavoidable, but how to fit this into a paper? Then we come to basically this eventually, like this experience here, or this process here of standing here talking in the forest, looking at the cattle, like the birds are making their alarm sounds because they saw the cat. They are alarming their fellows. There they are, the birds. Like this is it. We don't know what consciousness really is, like in conceptual terms. It's really difficult to define consciousness even though it's here all the time. And I think that even though I just criticized the so-called fundamental nature of reality, I think everything is interconnected in this like processual way. That if we look at physics, like everything is all the time interconnected unless we artificially isolate a system. I feel like I'm losing the thread. Like everything is one, I mean. Not in the sense that everything would be like this some fundamental substance or something that we could know of. I don't think that question is not interesting in my opinion. But everything is one in the sense that there are no gaps in nature, as some philosophers say. There are no gaps in nature. Like from the external reality to my psyche or my mind, there is no gap. My mind is this biochemical process in my brain which constantly interacts with my body and with the external environment through the senses. And eventually when I die, it just dissolves with all the rest of the processes. So it's all a continuum, and also mind, so-called mind and matter. They are only like, well, I don't know if I should go in the paper into this epistemic gap problem, like why does it seem that mind is so different from the environment? I think this is also like just a misconception. Like, how would we know that the mind is somehow different from the rest of the reality? Like the cat there. Like how would I know that the cat is somehow different from my mind? Obviously it's not, because the cat has its own mind. Or the trees, it's the same kind of biological process as I am. It's all the same type of causal process, physical process all the way through. And in evolved life, it's like biochemical processes, living, self-sustaining processes. And this is it. This is the way it feels from the inside. So it's consciousness, basically, you could say, or whatever it is that this is. It's this. This is it. So, bloody heck, I don't know how to condense this into a research paper, and now I want to go home and to the gym. I have squat day today, and then I have a meeting and do some writing. But I need to make a new video of like trying to condense this all into a paper. There's first a question about the fundamental nature of reality. I think I need to start with that. Define that in relation to these two notions of the fundamental, like intrinsic nature in previous philosophy, and reject the notion of relational intrinsic nature, or like intrinsic nature in the sense of non-relational nature, and instead go towards process philosophy, where intrinsic nature would be defined in this epistemic sense, that it's just what the reality is like beyond our representations. Okay, so here are the two main first steps. The title of the paper is "What is the fundamental nature of reality?" Yeah, modestly. And then I define two senses of the fundamental nature, which I have been describing here. And importantly, in the epistemic sense, the fundamental nature, it's an epistemic question related to knowledge. So we basically end up in different types of knowledge. We have, now I get it. We have relational knowledge, like the way that I know this cat through interacting. There is me, myself, or this organism, this body, which is causally interacting with this other organism, which is the cat. And there's a dog. She likes dogs. Is interested in dogs. So types of knowledge. The way I know things through representing things. The cat also knows through representing. It has an idea of the dog, and it knows that the dog went that way, but the dog exists independently of the cat. Like, this is all trivial, but the cat doesn't know what the dog is like independently of the cat herself, and I don't know what the cat is like independently of myself. Because the only way I can know the cat is through interacting with the cat, to representing it, through thinking of it, or like creating conceptions of it, or representations of it. And none of my conceptions or perceptions, or my ideas or thoughts or concepts of the cat None of them is the cat. This is all trivial, but when you get this, it changes everything. This is what the Zen people mean by saying that the word is not the object. Because we all the time we mistake the words for the object. We think I think that I know what the cat is. Oh, this is the cat. But I fail to understand that this is just a perception. Of course, I do interact with the cat in itself. I believe that the cat exists. But the only way I can know the cat is through interacting with the cat. And the only thing in this universe who knows what the cat is in itself is the cat in itself. The cat knows what it's like to be a cat. I know what it's like to be me, although I cannot conceptualize it. No. And especially the cat cannot conceptualize it because it's just a simple little animal. Not so simple. I wouldn't survive in this forest without external help, but she does. She's much more intelligent than me in this sense. She would survive here for how long? Some helst. Okay, but it all comes down to different types of knowledge. So the only way I can know this cat is through representing the cat. But the way I know my own consciousness is through being myself. Like, what is the self? And so, I don't care. Through being this, or just this, like existence. Being and becoming, and however you would call it, is ineffable. You cannot describe it because all the descriptions are representations. They are distinct from what this is. So I know my own consciousness, my own being, this certain causal process which is identical with my consciousness. You could call it the neural correlate of consciousness, for example. I think we would need to widen it to some kind of like biochemical correlate of consciousness, which would include the body, possibly, and maybe even the external objects that I interact with. The way I see it is in terms of causal hubs. Like my experience now is a causal network, like a process, which there's a like dense hub of nodes in the network, which are like my own body, brain, all the neurons interacting. That's the hub, and you see only the outside. You could open my head and you would see the brain, and you could model it or like image it with like neural imaging techniques, and you would see all the interactions. But they are also interacting like with the face and with the like the talking system. I don't know the correct words, and with the body, and through I inhale and exhale all the time. So it's just a hub which is like this organism, this biological animal here, but it's constantly interacting with everything else. So it's not separate from the rest of the reality. If you think of it as you see it from the outside, you see how I interact all the time. If you would cut my oxygen supply, I would die very fast. So I'm all the time in the reality and interacting with the reality. I cannot be separated from this reality. I'm like a fish in the sea. So it's like what I call this experience is a hub in the constantly changing network of causal interactions. Do you agree, Kat? Yes. Okay, so this gives me my own experience. This experience right now, it gives me a slight glimpse into the fundamental nature of reality. If we define fundamental nature of reality as that's something, for example, the fundamental nature of the cat is the way the cat is independently of my perceptions, representations, conceptions, and everything of the cat. But what about myself? Of course, I can represent myself. I can create like narratives of myself, like Jussi julkaisi this and that, blah 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 blah. But that's just a narrative. That's just like conceptual. That's a language game. And I can like metacognitively reflect on my own thoughts, like what it's like to be standing here. But that's a reflection, not. Yeah, but this is like it leads to like muddy waters again, because even my act of reflecting on myself is in my consciousness. So I just cannot escape this fundamental first person's perspective, or this like what I have called the unitary knowledge, like what it's like to be myself, knowing true being. This is the kind of like mystical knowledge. But then like philosophers would like to make like some kind of general notions of the nature of all of reality, not just about my own mind. So can we make any claims about the nature of all of reality, in the fundamental nature of all of reality? Well, no, we cannot. Because the direct access we have to the reality is only, or that I have, is this perspective. My direct access to the reality, which I can know through being, is only that part of reality which I am identical with. Like this being here. Although it's connected with everything else all the time, it's only this limited part of reality. And it would be just like chauvinistic and arrogant to think that this limited creature here, myself, this organism, this animal, would somehow have direct access to the fundamental nature of all of reality. It makes no sense. It would mean that we would lose our individual perspective altogether. It sort of happens when we die. But yes, well, that would be another question. How would anybody like bring back the knowledge from death? Some people would talk about ego death and like psychedelics and mystical experience. Well, I don't really think that they do enable any kind of like knowledge about the reality at large. It only enables knowledge, direct unitary knowledge by being, about a certain biochemical process here. And we cannot say anything about the fundamental nature of reality in this wider sense of like what everything is, like what the trees, the cats, the rocks and everything. We cannot make those kinds of claims. Philosophers do make those kinds of claims, but you cannot falsify or verify the claims. You cannot know. You can represent the nature of the rock, the atoms in the rock. You can create scientific models and all kinds of representations like I am making here, tactile and visual perceptions. I know the rock relationally, but to know what the rock is in itself, I would need to be the rock. So I simply cannot escape this individual perspective. And it leads the conclusion. Now the conclusion. The conclusion is that I only have this little slight insight into the fundamental nature of reality through myself. I know directly only this part of reality here. And nothing else. Everything else I can only represent. So it follows that the fundamental nature of reality, beyond this part of the reality, is a mystery. And because philosophers love isms, you could call this Mysterianism. So it's not idealism, because you cannot say that the rock is fundamentally something mental, because that would be to say something about the fundamental nature of something whose fundamental nature we cannot know. Well, you can represent it as ideal, for example. I don't think there are like good arguments for the conclusion that the rock is ideal fundamentally. The cat agrees. Or you can argue that it's physical, consists of dead non-conscious matter. There are very good arguments for that position as well. But which is true, we don't know. So this is like metaphysical agnosticism, sort of. Like agnosticism about different metaphysical conceptual constructs or isms. Agnosticism about them. But it's Mysterianism about the fundamental, so-called fundamental nature of this rock. Like what is this rock beyond my perception of it, or my scientific models and all my like ideas of the rock? I cannot know. The rock is a mystery. The cat is a mystery. I myself am a mystery for the most part, but not for this part. I know what this is. Through being this, I know. Bye bye.